Coming up on this week's RegCast.
I think it's a discussion about being predictive and forward-looking versus retrospective that leads us right to the desktop.
If you're not operating in this sort of predictive space today, you're probably outside the pack.
People want an enterprise tool and an enterprise sale. And again, that's why we're going after the end-to-end, the 90% of have it all under one hood so you can achieve that dashboard.
Welcome to RegCast.
RegCast.
Hello and welcome to RegCast 18. I'm PJ DiGiamarino, CEO of JWG, and I'm really pleased to be able to have another RegCast in the run-up to our conference coming up in only 2 weeks' time. With me today are two experts in the surveillance and compliance field. I'm trying to get a little bit of a better sense about what is the future of the compliance desktop. And my thinking here is over the past 17 RegCasts, we covered a plethora of discussions. We've looked at accountability, we've talked about data collection, we've talked about industry common domain modeling, central bank digital currencies, lots of good stuff, but then we haven't really talked about the core infrastructure compliance much. We have talked about the pain of horizon scanning, and that was a couple of good RegCasts on that recently. We talked about the real challenge around controls, and when we talked about digitizing compliance at the point of trade, but it still leaves me questioning, and a lot of you in the audience I'm sure agree, what's the future about the tech stack for compliance? Where's it going to live, and how's it going to fit together? Now, fortunately, we have a paper to help us here, a joint AFME, which is the Association for Financial Markets in Europe, and PwC, put together a report on conduct analytics. And I thought this was a great place to start this conversation because it tried to lay out a blueprint for how the industry is going to suck in lots of information about what's happening and present it for people to observe. Now, there are tons of issues in doing that, and I'll let the fine gentleman here spell those out. But I think it's just a discussion about being predictive and forward-looking versus retrospective that leads us right to the desktop. So without further ado, Richard, could you please introduce yourself?
PJ, thanks. Richard Bain. I lead the Conduct and Conflict Surveillance Program globally for State Street Bank and Trust.
Thank you, Richard. No stranger to RegCast. Raj, this is your first time. Tell us where you're from.
Sure. Thanks, PJ. Good to be on here, and good to meet you, Richard as well. Raj Bakhru, ACA's Chief Innovation Officer. ACA works with a good number of financial services firm, and I oversee our RegTech solutions, including our solutions in the surveillance space.
Thanks very much for being here, both of you guys. Now, I think the place I'd like to start is the regulatory expectation. Richard, we've spoken a lot about what conduct means, but what's the oversight expectation? What's the approach people are supposed to be able to take, and what's the scope of it?
Yeah, sure, PJ. I think the first thing there's two things I'd sort of like to sort of point out to get us started. The traditional regulatory expectation for conduct oversight has historically been focused on the identify and remediate, style of compliance. I think certainly and predominantly more so from our European regulators, the shift is definitely moving towards identify, remediate, and predict. And I think that predict piece is going to be a real core fundamental requirement for a forward-looking compliance officer. I think it's also interesting, actually, in the environment that we're operating today, that our securities regulators tend to be pushing us to a place where they're looking for more sophisticated, perhaps what you would consider more invasive surveillance capability, and that very much is at conflict with our privacy regulators in terms of what they expect. And then a good example of that would be GDPR. Now, of course, GDPR never actually prevents you necessarily from taking action to surveil, but it does place some fairly onerous requirements around legitimate purpose, and the controls and the sort of risk mitigation you have to have within the surveillance program itself.
And before we dig into the privacy issues too much, can I just bring you back to this predictive piece? Because I just want to make sure we understand and are on the same page what a big difference that is from what happens today. Can you explain a little bit more about what you think are the big step changes there?
Yeah, I mean, I think what it does involve is we have to be able to build scalable, accessible, data-driven surveillance models and technology capabilities. I don't think those necessarily need to leverage the most sophisticated types of technology, AI, machine learning, etc. But certainly I see more of that coming into the domain over the course of the coming years. But I think, largely what you're getting away is, knocking down some of these silos to sort of data and sort of building scalable enterprise-wide solutions that can help you identify, remediate and predict, future conduct risk. I also think it's interesting that, we're actually seeing conduct being viewed by European regulators as very much a real important measure of culture, right? And so culture and conduct are weaving together more so than ever before.
Can you give us an example of some of the silos that get knocked together? I guess I'm aware a lot of this is fairly manually driven at the moment. I'm trying to get a sense of what bringing this to data really means.
Yeah, so it's a great question. So PG, let me explain a little bit about what the reporting requirements are from and when I talk about reporting requirements, I'm talking about executive level reporting requirements, risk committee reporting requirements that come out of a compliance program. We're going to be looking at reporting on core compliance risks, it's your non-financial compliance risks, embedded compliance risks, specialist compliance risks, and we're also going to be reporting our status as it relates to our compliance with our regulatory obligations. The way I tend to unfortunately see this develop, that's from a top-down approach, is that all of those end reports tend to be produced individual siloed programs that are building their own technology stack, their own operating model, and their own surveillance mechanisms to generate all of that information that creates their program and feeds into that executive level view of conduct and culture. I think that what we really ought to now start to think about actually as we move forward is actually how do we perhaps overcome some of those silos, and how do we actually create a technology and a data and an infrastructure environment that allows us all to sort of collaborate across those various different data sets. And I think what's really important within that, reporting is that specialist sort of first line of defense, reporting it, to an executive level, because we start to see a very, federalized and a very siloed sort of spin-off of, multiple report requirements. And what this is telling us is actually there is no one office or one individual or one department within a large financial institution that's responsible for conduct and culture, and particularly the monitoring and surveillance of that. There's many persons wearing many hats, and often these individuals are not particularly well connected, nor are their organization, infrastructure, and the technology they're using.
I think that's an excellent point. Roger, I'd like to come to you on the same question. What Richard describes to me is in some ways great and revolutionary, but in some ways incredibly dangerous and difficult for the organization to come together on. What's your perspective?
Putting aside the privacy regulations, which again will defer to the financial services regulations for the most part, I think Richard's on point. A lot of this is about bringing disparate sets of data together and then applying, frankly, disruptive technologies, NLP and ML, to do more and better with that, to analyze, to surveil, to understand conduct. I'll give you examples, right? There might be GIFs in an instant message chat, right? And you need to understand the emotion, the sentiment of that GIF to properly understand what's being conveyed between the two parties and see if there's a conduct concern there. You need to understand language and slang, right? There's all these intricacies about how you analyze the data, particularly the unstructured data, to do this in a really smart way. But you can't do that in isolation. It's not just that, communications data. It's the pairing with trade activities, with outside business activities. It's understanding, if there was an expert network meeting or a corporate access meeting that might influence insider knowledge, news and earnings events tied and correlated against all of this data. Really, this is an application of big data and breaking down the silos that used to exist between these data sets in the world, and then applying smarter technologies to really understand what's going on.
And I guess that's a fundamental point you raised, which is it could be big data, but by the same token, compliance is looking at little data, is looking at very specific silos today. So fundamentally, you potentially have an ocean of new data that you could bring in, and I guess that therein lies the question is, when you managed it in a silo, it was for a reason. It was keep it safe, keep prying eyes out, make sure just the right people knew. Now you're opening it up. What are the dangers and some of the risks there?
There's certainly obviously plenty of privacy risk, and even within the firm. So put aside GDPR, exposure of an executive's email to others in the firm is just very sensitive data. So we increasingly rely on technology to do this. The technologists obviously will have to support, and some will gain access to data that they didn't historically have. But we're trying to take away sort of the access to the raw data by applying the algorithms and then showing the output of the algorithms and allowing an investigation on the findings when there are findings versus sort of what we used to do in the older days of, there's a set number of people in the firm and the compliance department that could go look at any email from the executive. So in some ways, you can actually enforce better privacy and better controls by moving to these smarter models where you're doing more reactive investigation work versus sort of rote, let's go look at everything manual work.
Yeah, I hear you, and I guess that, at the end of the day, I'd rather have a model that was predicting the results for me than everybody go paw through every email. But then it has big implications on my staff, right? I got to have a pretty savvy people on hand to be able to manage this, because you need to have a human in the loop. You can't get, the AI told me that this was bad behavior isn't good enough, right, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I mean, I think there's also a case that needs to be said here is, I'm as a compliance professional, a little bit torn on this, right? Because for all of the progress firms are making within their surveillance capabilities, I think if you ask compliance practitioners, the number one source of real meat on the bone compliance or conduct or cultural issues is through employee whistleblowing, speaking up about concerns that they see in the workplace. So surveillance will never capture the entirety of your conduct risk, and invariably it doesn't the big real meaty issues either. So it can be something that's relatively targeted and relatively focused to meet specific requirements. But I think aside from that, though, so being torn in that in that direction, if you like, what I would say is I think you made the point there. You've got a lot of teams that are sort of siloed into their own data, but they're not just siloed data, right? They're building out their own operating model. They're resourcing that operating model. They're building scalable technology, but you might have multiple surveillance teams engaged with different vendors, building scalable technology solutions for a very similar type purpose. Now, what that tells me is you're not optimizing the way that you execute your surveillance and your conduct monitoring across the firm. And where there are going to be privacy issues, access right concerns, those types of things, you're creating a duplicate of those issues by the way that you're building those technology and infrastructure stacks, out independently and by line of business, by surveillance function, etc. The other issue I think that is a real risk here is that I've spoke about some of the sort of multiple end products that produce. So we talk about a compliance dashboard. The reality is it's compliance dashboards, right? Multiple and often quite numerous. What that tells me is, as an executive level, it's going to be very, very difficult for you to really see the woods through the trees when it comes to understanding what your conduct risk really looks like, and actually how that's intersecting with financial crime risks and cultural risks.
Richard, I'm very glad you said that, because there's a paper that just got released about the, it was more on the reporting side of life, but it was looking at the cross-asset class consolidation of systems and how we need, it'd be much better if we had a cross-asset class infrastructure out there. The only problem with that is I've been hearing that for 20 years. And I guess I wonder, when it comes to compliance, then can we really think about getting those efficiencies, or are we going to be forced into each silo to be able to tap the core systems and then effectively repeat the oversight for every individual business?
I mean, Raj, it may be a good question. I mean, my view is we'll never quite find the perfect solution, and it almost, if we could simplify that, that structure and access to data and systems and etc. What I can see is there's more systems, there's more sources of data coming at us faster than we can naturally react. So we'll never quite get there. It will always be an evolution, but certainly, we have to think about how do we simplify and optimize the model as best we can. I don't know, Raj, if you've got a particular view on that.
I do. We've certainly set out to try to build that. So I'm probably a bit biased in my view, because I've drank the Kool-Aid, as they say, on this front. I will say, as you think about every function out there, right? The CFO has a tool. They have their ERP, NetSuite, what have you. The CHRO has a tool, Workday, LT Pro, whatever it is. The compliance officers never had a tool of record, right? Their central tool of record that does the end-to-end workflow. And that's what we've set out to achieve. I agree that you'll never be full scope, right? So even in the HR arena, that system of record covers 90% of what you need to do, and there's additional systems you have to integrate in. And open architecture is always key, right? That's just basic building blocks and being able to get your systems to talk to each other. But you need that 90% system, and that doesn't exist today. We've set out to do that. I think we're well on our journey, but there's always more to do. And frankly, everyone today is relying on a suite of point solutions, strong point solutions, but that's going to get rolled up and brought together so that you do have that system of record, and you can achieve that dashboard, or at least the 90% dashboard, off that singular solution.
This sounds a bit like Lord of the Rings. The one ring to bind them all, except it's almost.
Yeah, the reality is the compliance space is ever evolving, right? There will be disruptive technologies. There will be new regulations that drive new technologies. No one will ever have the 100% solution at any point in time. But the folks who set out to do that will get to 90%, and then you'll supplement with niche things if you have a specific type of product or an asset class or something that's implicated by a certain regulation that's not as mainstream. You may need a niche solution there, but you want to at least have the tool that can cover off the heavy majority.
Well, let's talk about a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about the future architecture then, because I really appreciate this perspective of it all coming together. But there are some lines we need to be really careful of, and Richard referred to some earlier on in terms of privacy. But video right now, huge battleground, enormous disparity even in Europe about what's permissible, what's not. Take that out to China, move it to the US, have that conversation here in the UK, you get completely different answers again. It's going to be extremely difficult to have a global infrastructure dealing with video communication policy. How do you wrestle with something like that, Richard?
Well, first and foremost, it's a real challenge. And as I say, I think our securities and our other regulators are diverging in that, and so we spoke previously on the implication of the Roe and Kitty issue and sort of what that means, and that tells me very clearly that our securities regulators are setting expectations for us that for instance our privacy regulators would be very uncomfortable with. So in terms of architecture, and if you're for me, if you are a chief compliance officer out there at the moment thinking about how, what the priorities for me, I would say you want to simplify as much as possible. You want to be thinking about how do you optimize your surveillance capability? How do you build in scale? How do you, and not build it many times and deploy it many times, but maybe perhaps think about building it once and deploying it many. But also be very, very cautious, about you need to have an enterprise-wide view. And I think Raj mentions that no single compliance tool. And that, that does limit our ability to see truly at an enterprise level. And I think part of that's because we start off building out, a relatively complex architecture to support our compliance program, and just keep it simple. Always think about optimization, and always think about how do I achieve an enterprise view of this particular risk.
No, that sounds like good advice, Raj. What do you think?
Specifically around things like video, as much as there are regional compliance requirements that are unique, they tend to move in the same direction in this regard, right? There's the desire by regulators for firms to gather more and do more with what they gather. Where there's disparity is data sovereignty requirements often, right? So Brazil doesn't want their data leaving Brazil. And how do you bring that into your global context? But that's also part of why you're going to need a larger, more enterprise system that can handle those types of complexities, that can handle very complex permissioning and access schemes. That's just the direction that the world is moving to be able to support, global enterprise and global compliance, where, your employee is not in Brazil 365 days of the year. So what do you do with the data when they're there and when they're not? How do you bring all of that together? Those are problems that need to be solved. Complex problems that need to be solved, and having the systems out there to do that that just don't exist today is going to be key.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, but I guess the courts ultimately make the decision here. It's not the regulators, and those courts are national. I mean, I think I just posted a case yesterday on the LinkedIn Trade Surveillance Group for RegTech. It was a Australian court ruled against a New York data scraping tool company that it had misused people's data in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So
yeah, I mean, PJ, just on that, I think it comes back to the core principles, right? And this is stuff where I think actually GDPR has been very, very helpful, right? We've also seen this within, if you think the Uber space, the Deliveroo space, where they're using mobile-based data from those individuals that work for them to not necessarily track conduct or risks that they have a sort of legal, contractual or regulatory obligation to sort of meet, but they're monitoring it for their employees' performance metrics, right? And I think that's where you start. Did the Deliveroo spend 2 minutes longer delivering the pizza than they ought to, right? I think that's where you're going to get yourself into some tricky situations. But if we bring it back to the principles, the first principle of GDPR is make sure you have a legitimate purpose for the data you're collecting, and the data you're processing. And often those legitimate purposes are contractual, legal, or regulatory. And if you're starting to lose sight of that at the start, I think you'll probably end up losing sight of it at the end of the process. So I'd come back to those sort of principles that GDPR sets, and that primary principle, which is legitimate purpose for make sure you understand that as a compliance professional.
And thankfully, I think most privacy regimes have started from GDPR and based themselves off GDPR, including a number here in the States. So
yeah,
that carries over.
Yeah, it does get tricky when you move to Asia, but I think ultimately there is a transatlantic position there, but you need to get the controls right. You need to make sure that you're architecting correctly to handle that. I guess the final point I wanted to circle back to was really, what does this all mean at the end of the day for the conduct agenda? And Richard, you touched on a couple points. One was Roaring Kitty, aka Mr. Gill over in Mass Mutual, they got a $4 million fine for the issues there. Wasn't really clear to me that that was all to do with surveilling what happened on the internet. When I read the 18 pages, it seemed to be a lot of process there that seemed to have fallen down. Yeah, my question, as we start to think about deploying the broader, these controls across the broader infrastructure, is how much can you do with process and how much do you need to do with data? Any thoughts, Richard?
Well, it's a difficult question, right? I mean, it's not, and there's no immediate answer to it. And I think depending on your organization, the answer might be quite different. You know, I do think that, you know, we have to get to a point where, you know, we go back to sort of the underlying sort of principles of compliance, which for me are, you know, risk identification, risk assessment, risk monitoring, and risk reporting. And so, you know, I think when we, you know, and some of that will involve data, some of that will involve processes, but for me, I do think that what we need to think about is making sure that we build out a strong predictive element to our compliance program. I think, you know, if I had one message that I would, you know, I'd message to compliance professionals in this you know, RegCast is this: look, if you're not operating in the sort of predictive space today, you're probably outside the pack, right? You know, or behind the pack, right? Now, there's varying degrees of sophistication of people within that pack, but, you know, I think, and, you know, you referenced earlier in the call the white paper that sort of drove this discussion. I mean, you know, of the 25 firms that were surveyed in that white paper, 48% of them were using conduct analytics today, and they expect that to grow to about 84% in the future, right? So we're seeing that shift, and that's a fairly sizable shift at the same time. I think there's another thing that I would point out here as we think about more, you know, performing surveillance, conduct analytics. There's two things. Let's not forget that often in our interest, and probably don't do it professionals, but don't forget to monitor what good conduct is, right? I think you're far more likely to influence your organization by telling them what's good, what works well, what's a positive conduct, you know, scenario. But because we're compliance professionals surrounded with all the surveillance capability, we tend to focus on the negative, the bad actors, the bad conduct outcomes, and as a consequence, it often comes to our colleagues. And then lastly, you know, I just say that, you know, let's just make sure that we are working through all of the sort of requirements with our first and second, you know, across the first and second line, and to some extent the third line as well. Like, we're not, you know, we need a combination of, you know, first and second line and third line expertise and input into these various you know, conduct analytics and surveillance programs to make sure that they're effective.
Fantastic, thank you. You beat me to my summary question. I think you answered it before I even asked. Raj, how would you sum up to follow that?
We've seen the writing on the wall with three things, and that's sort of how we've been trying to position as a firm. We see the writing on the wall with people bringing more data together. So we've been trying to, you know, bring in additional modules, build that end-to-end tool set for compliance alpha. We've seen the writing on the wall with advanced AI and natural language processing against communications and surveillance. And that's why we went out and acquired Catellis, a comms firm, and brought it into compliance alpha. We've seen the writing on the wall with the enterprise. People want an enterprise tool and an enterprise sale. And again, that's why we're going after the end-to-end, the 90% of have it all under one hood so you can achieve that dashboard. That's our strategy. So that's why what we've been seeing and why we've been going after it.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for coming here to share your perspectives, gentlemen. I look forward to getting more of this discussion onto tape on, well, in live in person coming up in under 2 weeks. So thanks everybody for hanging in there. It's been a fantastic set of discussions in and around our conference. You want more detail, go to regtechfs.com or you go to regtechconference.co.uk, and we look forward to seeing you here on RegCast soon. Thanks very much.
You can go to our conference website, which is regtechconference.co.uk, or go to the JWG website, which is jwg-it.eu. This is RegCast,
where we shine a light on banking digitization.